Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the DX Mentor, QRP DXing and Contesting. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill, AJB, the DX Mentor. My guests are DX gurus that we can all learn from. In this episode, we will have a detailed discussion of QRP DXing and contesting. My guests are Joe, WAGEX, Tom, NR8Z, and Randy, ND0C. I'm back after sailing to V4 and KP2, and I'm ready to go with some great podcasts, great guests, and some great YouTube episodes coming up. I hope you'll be with us. I wanted to say a special hello to my friend, Bob McCullough. Bob is not yet a ham, but listens to every episode, and he had some great questions during my recent sailing excursion. Hello to Bob, and please keep the questions coming. Now, let's tune into our gurus and find out what they're discussing. So with us today, we have a esteemed group of folks who are going to teach us about QRP contesting and QRP DXing, and I'm really excited about this. I think there's a lot of great techniques to be learned from this discussion, and I just can't wait. So let me get everybody introduced, and then we'll move forward. So as always, going clockwise on my screen, we have Joe, WAGEX. Joe, get us started.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, Randy. Nice to meet you on this podcast this morning. I've been an amateur since 1970, and I've been a DXer pretty much from day one. And I work all the bands. I guess my heart pretty well lays in 60 meters, but I'm active on all the bands and got all the certificates and all that stuff.
Okay, well, that's good. I appreciate that. Tom, NR8Z.
Well, good morning, all, and nice to see you. And good morning, Randy. Nice to meet you. I've been a ham for more than 45 years, and I was a little slower to getting to DX, but someone showed me the way, and I enjoy making DX contacts. I get a chance to operate portable, so I do a lot of that as QRP, often camping or just away from home. And I'm looking forward to all the different bands and my next 40 countries.
And how many are at as of this morning?
I'm at 305 total, 300 current. I'm trying to catch that guy on the list in the club just ahead of me.
Well, that's what I was worried about. I didn't know if I had to make up another one just to stay ahead of you. And finally, our guest of honor from way out west, Randy, ND0 Charlie. Tell us about yourself.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit about QRP, DXing, and contesting. I was first licensed back in '68 when I got my novice, and of course got my general a year later. And I jumped into DXing pretty quickly. I just was fascinated with the idea of DXing and piling up countries and pursuing awards, and got involved in contesting about the same time, which I saw as a way to pile up some more countries with the DX contest. And then it was in the late 70s that I started getting attracted to QRP. I'd been reading the columns by Adrian Weiss in CQ magazine. His current call is W0RSP, but I think A did a lot to as an ambassador for QRP, but it certainly hooked me. So in 1980, when the power supply on my QRO rig self-destructed, I took the plunge and got a Ten-Tech Argonaut and haven't looked back since. It's been a blast. I just love the magic of what you can do with QRP.
And to that point, you've done quite a lot, Randy. What all have you achieved with QRP?
Well, again, with the DXing, I guess I didn't know any better that it should be harder than it apparently really is to DX with QRP. When I first started in March of '80, we were a pretty good point in the sunspot cycle. So I just jumped on and started working countries, and I was just amazed by what could be done. And I think a lot of it is just persistence and getting after it. But so I jumped in the CQ WPX contest a couple weeks later. I think I went single band 10 meters, and I had really good success. It was just crazy. But to this point in time, DX wise, I'm at 322 worked, 320 confirmed. I've gotten worked all zones, different modes and bands. By the way, I pretty much focus on sideband and CW, and also play around on satellites and 6 meters. But and then in the contest, I've been fortunate enough to win some of the domestic stuff as well as some of the DX contests. So it's just a matter of getting in there and getting after it. So it's been fun. It's been quite a trip.
And you've achieved all that with QRP. I want to make that point, and especially sideband QRP, right?
Yeah, I've got actually I've got 319 confirmed on single sideband with QRP, and I think what I think helps to dispel the notion that you can't do sideband with QRP. Again, I didn't know any better, so I just did it.
Yeah, what's the old saying? If you don't tell them it's impossible, they'll never find out, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, well, congratulations to you, and I think everybody can see why we were just excited to have you on the podcast to talk about this. So, as far as myself, I've been licensed since '71. I really have only been chasing DX for about 25 years. And the only real, it's not really QRP in its purest form, but I had a rig in the car. And when you are operating mobile, it's close to QRP. But I did confirm 153 from the car. But more importantly, I learned a lot of lessons that probably in those 2 years, I learned more about operating than I had in all the other years. So I'm just excited to kind of see what else we can learn today. So speaking of QRP, let's get started then. Randy, how is QRP actually defined?
Well, I think that's a $64,000 question. I think that definition has evolved over the last, probably 40, 50 years or more. Back when the QRP ARCI club was first organized, they were looking at 100 watts, of course, 100 watts input as QRP. Of course, nowadays, it's considerably less. I think, but where there's still, I think, some disagreement is how many watts of sideband is considered QRP. There's certainly some folks that feel 10 watts is QRP. I'm not going to take issue with that. I've always gone with the 5 watt limit for single sideband as well as CW, and largely because that's what the contest sponsors have settled on for that category in their contest, and also the award sponsors that do have endorsements for QRP usually settle on 5 watts. That's not universal, but for me, it's 5 watts.
Okay, Tom, what's your experience been with QRP?
I've used the 5 watt limit myself, whether it's sideband or CW. Most of my QRP though is CW. I started with a home built rig on 30 meters, and that was my QRP rig when I had a lot of time and not much money. And so now I move on to commercially produced rigs. But yeah, I think you can do amazing things with QRP, and I don't think it matters whether it's 5 or 10 watts, but I don't think it's 100 anymore.
All right, Joe, have you done any QRP?
No.
Do you have any desire to do any QRP?
No, my QRP is all these amplifiers here. I'm sorry to admit that, but no, being a DXer and being out on a lot of D expeditions and that, I've always felt that you need some power. But Randy, I've got a question. What about antennas? Antennas are always the main part of our amateur radio setup. So do you agree? And what do you use for antennas on QRP?
I agree 100%, Joe. It's all about the antennas, and I think no matter what rig you're using, it's what you're going to do with that amount of power when it leaves the radio, and that includes feed lines. I think that's something that sometimes we tend to forget about. But low loss feed lines, obviously. But antennas, I've got a tri-bander Yagi. It's only 40 feet high. I'm limited here by regulations within the city. But it's in fact, it's an antenna that's no longer made. It was made by Cycle 24, a small company that eventually got bought out, but it's no longer available. But it has 2 elements on 20, 2 elements on 15, and 4 elements on 10. Optimum spacing, full length elements. So electronically or electrically, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's been good for me. So that's what I use in the high bands, and then the low bands, I've got just an inverted V. But to my point earlier about feed line, I feed that with ladder line and tune it. So just trying to get as much out of that signal as possible. I don't think it's cheating to have big antennas if you're running QRP. I think the bigger antenna, the more power to you, whatever you have available to you.
So what about, Randy, what about running hard line?
I have not used hardline, Joe. I've got a fairly short run because my tower's not very high, and the tower sits right against the house pretty much. So it's only a 60-foot run. So I didn't feel the justification to run hardline. But if I had a long run, yes, I think hardline would make a lot of sense.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm using good coax. I'm using 400 LMR.
Sure.
Well, okay. Tom, you had sent an email to me saying, hey, make sure we talk about antennas. And did you have something in mind since we jumped over to that?
Yeah, when I do a lot of portable operating, and over the years I've discovered it's really about antenna efficiency. I've never done well with ground mounted verticals, but I have done well with verticals that have elevated radials. And then, I like to avoid anything with, tuning coil. So I do a dipole. And as Randy said, I feed a dipole with ladder line. One of my favorites for field day is to put up a 80-meter dipole fed with ladder line, with a fiberglass pole, and then tune it. And you can cover almost every band. And for a field day operation, it's not as critical which way you're pointing the antenna. So all those lobes work out great. But yeah, I stay away from anything. I've tried things like the, hustlers mounted on cars, and anything with a tuning coil, I find just eats up the power.
I agree with you, Tom. And I like what you said about dipoles. When I've operated on summits with summits on the air, running QRP there, of course, also. But I like dipoles, just a dipole fed with twin lead and a tuner. It just works extremely well. I'm just old fashioned. I like a dipole for a portable.
Isn't it amazing how the sunspots can help you have a much better antenna?
For sure.
Of course, that's important too. What about operating techniques? Anybody want to talk about if you're going to do QRP, you can't get in and slug it out in pileups anymore. Or I would think, and I could be wrong, but I wouldn't think if you're going to be in a contest, you could necessarily hold a frequency, right? So you might be better off doing search and pounce. So any thoughts on the different techniques that you need?
Well, I'll jump in first.
Yeah.
You're exactly right, Bill. It's you can't use brute force to overwhelm a pileup or the competition. So it does boil down to technique and trying to be smart and choosing your battles. If there's a monster pileup early, like in the contest on the first day, DX contest, those big guns are going to be around the second day and more likely to be begging for contacts. So I'm inclined to let those guys go unless they're really loud and the pilot isn't too bad, then I'll jump in. But it's a matter of choosing your battles and timing. And also the other thing is finding the multipliers, whether it's a stateside contest or a DX contest, finding the multipliers before they get spotted, or at least before a huge pileup. So in contests, I do not use spotting networks. That's just a personal philosophy. It's not trying to make a statement. For me, I just need to find those stations before the packet cluster hordes descend on them.
Okay, wow. So, Joe, I'm curious. I know you said you don't work QRP, but you've been on the other end on Swains and Midway, and so from your DX standpoint now, what would you recommend that we do if we're going to use QRP to try to get through to a Midway or a Swains?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. And I would suggest if the de-expedition operator is 5 to 10 up, then I would suggest go 12 up. Get out of that mess of that big pile up and get in the open, because I know from my experience, we'll work into that pile up 5 to 10 up, and then you sort of just get overwhelmed by it, and you want to scoot up and get away from all that commotion. And I worked a lot of stations 11 and 12 up outside the pile up. So that would be my recommendation. Get up, because you're just going to be swallowed up with all the big signals and probably never be heard out of that bunch. But if you get up, with any luck at all, you'll be by yourself calling the DX station and make a new country.
So one thing I've meant to ask you all along is one of the techniques I used to use from the car was tail ending, and some people like that and some people hate it. And by tail ending, I mean when the DX station confirms WAGEX and he'll pause, I'll throw my call in there when everybody else is kind of listening. How is that effective, or was I really just getting lucky?
If you're asking me, I would say that's a good position to be in, because you want your call to be heard by that DX station, and whatever it takes to get him or her to hear that call, I think that's the important thing. So I see nothing wrong with that.
Okay, Tom, you have any thoughts on that stuff?
I also think I agree with all of that. I think timing is important as well. I've been always amazed when I can muster the patience to, count off that half a second before putting my call in. We all have about the same reaction time. So when that, especially on CW, when that DX station sends TU, you can tell everybody's reaction time is about the same. And if you just wait a half a beat and then you put your call in my case, I get a lot of 8Zs. I'm still a little early, but the tail end of my call gets through, and then I'm off and running.
I agree with exactly what you're saying, Tom, on the just making yourself hold off for that half second, whether CW or sideband. That aspect of the timing, and also shooting for those gaps. So if I drop my call and then after I drop my call, I'm hearing nothing, and the pileup kind of wanes for a second. Boy, I'm dropping it in there real quick again, trying to hit those gaps. And to the question about tail ending, Bill, yeah, I use it when I think I can do it, effectively and not coming off as a jerk. Obviously, we've all used tail ending, and the thing is, when I'm running QRP, really, I can't trounce somebody. I can't step on somebody, but because I don't have the power to step on somebody and cause a problem. But I still want to be smart, because I don't want somebody later thinking, oh, that QRP guy, that MD0C, his operating skills are totally lacking. But I think tail ending is a very good skill. And again, going back to the thing about timing that Tom mentioned, it's when you're running these power levels, it's got to be good timing. And I want to touch on a point that Joe made with respect to running split. I try to find the station that just is working the station right now, but I'm not going to call on his frequency, because I figure everybody else is. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to typically move up. And certainly, Joe, I've gone up to above the range. If they're listening 5 to 10, go up at 11. Just again, like you said, and it's good to hear from you from the other side of the pileup to confirm. But I've had guys tell me afterwards by email that, boy, if you had to been up there, I never would have hurt you. So it's validated.
Wow. I know the other thing, and we'll talk. I got another bullet point here later on listening, but how important is it really for anybody to listen? But when you are power constrained, listening is so important. And there's a ham in our club, Jay K4ZLE, and Jay swears that he can listen to an operator a couple times, and he almost knows who he is. Right. If he's an experienced operator that's been on before, Joe will recognize his cadence and his speed and his pauses. And then he's able to guess when the next pause is coming, and he'll jump in, and he's kind of made a practice. But I think that only works if you listen and pay attention. So we'll talk about listening after a bit, but that's really important. So when we're talking about split,
Bill, can I throw a question in?
Yeah, please.
While we're talking about calling and all, I have an opinion, but I thought I'd get everybody else's. What do you think about the idea of appending QRP to your call, whether it's CW or phone, when you're calling? Randy?
Well, I'll share my thought, Tom. In a contest, I never ever do that. But even for casual DXing, or trying to break a monster pileup like Midway, I personally, I never ever do that, because in the very early days I did, Tom, but I quickly quit doing it, because first of all, if they come back to the QRP station, there's going to be 100 other guys that call too, because that's not distinctively identifying an individual station. But it just makes the if you add it onto your call sign, it makes the call that much longer. You look at what we've got for call signs here. Nobody's 3x3 here, or 2x3. We're trying to get short call signs for a lot of reasons, but certainly for DXing and contesting. So why would I want to add a /QRP onto that personally? I just don't fool with it.
I have heard pileups where the DX will say, "Are there any mobile stations, or are there any QRP stations?" So every once in a while you'll hear that. It's typically not that massive pileup, but it is a situation where they're maybe the last couple of days, for instance, and they're just trying to give everybody a chance. And I'm always surprised how many people come back to them that I think are legitimate QRP or legitimate mobile stations. So that's always cool. Speaking of call signs, I was kind of looking at the three of us, and we'll leave Joe out of this. But like if for WPX contests, do you find that your call is actually a bit of a multiplier?
I know it works for me. I enjoy getting into WPX because suddenly I'm desirable. Yeah.
I agree, Tom. That's one of the reasons I got the call sign I did, because I love WPX, and so that was one of the incentives to drop the old WA0, which was pretty common garden variety, and get a little more unique prefix.
Well, I know there's a lot of W8s, but there's none like the one we have. So, Joe.
Well, at least you know that, Bill.
See, I know that. But unfortunately, I had to point it out for everybody else, but still. So I think we've talked a lot about DX. Maybe do you find that the one thing that I always surprise myself is every time I pick up in my case, the Flex manual, I learn something new. So even when I think I know my rig, it's like, well, I didn't know anything. Here's some more stuff. So how important is it to know, when you talk about split, exactly what that means, and the filters that you have at your disposal, and offsets and all those kinds of things? I mean, that's got to be a critical part of this, right, Tom?
Definitely. You have to be able to hear them, right? So the best receiver you can bring to bear on it, whether it's selective or sensitive, depending on what band you're on, is important when you're going to be, a lower level signal coming back out, right? 5 watts doesn't mean you have to have a regenerative receiver with no filters on it, right?
Randy, what do you think? Is that can't be overstated, right?
I agree completely with Tom. It's that's why I got this radio that I'm currently using. I got it for the receiver, and also the options, the filtering. It's great, and there's still things that I need to learn better about this radio. But the capabilities it has really help me on hearing stuff, because contrary to what you might think, sometimes if you can hear those weak stations and there's no QRM, with QRP you can get those weak stations. So it's not just a function of how loud the other guy is. But anyway, yeah, I think the point cannot be overstated. Good receiver and good antenna, which people don't think about when they, or at least at first blush, when you think about QRP.
All right. Let's switch gears a little bit then, and let's talk about QRP and contests. We've talked about DX and pileups and those kinds of things, and I know they're not really separate, but DX and contests. What comes to mind, Randy, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to use QRP in a contest? What's your approach then as you get ready for that?
Well, part of the initial thought process I go through is I want to do single band or all band, and I usually go all band. But then during the contest, typically, as you mentioned before, Bill, with QRP, it's usually search and pounce, but depending on conditions and depending on the contest. But for example, in a sweepstakes, usually I can do some running, call CQ and do some running. But again, depending on the band and the conditions, and I try to be smart about that. If I'm being effective with search and pounce, say in a DX contest, then I'm going to stay with that. If I'm doing 1 a minute or so, I'm happy with that. If that starts to peter out, or on the second day, I may go to search, or I may go to trying to run. But it is difficult to run. First of all, you're not as loud, so you're not going to be noticed. And just holding a frequency, so you don't get bumped off the frequency by somebody that just plain doesn't hear you. I tend to start high in the bands and work down to find mults. And again, as I mentioned previously, I do not use spotting for contesting. I do for DXing, but for contests, I do not use spotting. And I just start from the top down typically and work down. And that's been pretty effective for me. And I keep notes. I probably should do a better job of using the memory in my radio, but I'll make notes. If I find a station that's a new bolt, he's got a big pile up on him, I don't feel good about the population or the propagation right now, I'll just make a note that station X is on this frequency, and I'll come back to him 20 minutes, a half an hour.
Mhm.
Isn't it amazing when you battle out on a Saturday and you have no progress, and you come back Sunday and get him on the first or second call?
Yeah.
It's of course the challenge is you get some sort of a geomagnetic disturbance that wipes them out on Sunday, and they're not there at all. But
No guarantees.
no, which makes it fun. So, but trying to slug it out and then coming back a couple days, there's a certain feeling they're like, okay, I didn't have to waste all my time. I just got him. So, I'm kind of curious too. We've talked about listen, but I still find that there's just a ton of folks that even when the operator says up 5 to 10, they still call on frequency. And I just, after listening to Bouvet for as much as I did, you really get to the point where if people would follow what they're being told, then there'd be no need for the frequency police, and that whole thing would kind of reduce. And I mean, they can't yell at anybody if there's nobody there, right? So, but do you employ any? Do you have headsets? Do you guys have speakers? Do you do something differently when you're trying to dig that weak signal out, or you're trying to break through to a pile up and listen for clues and stuff? Do you do anything differently, Joe?
No, not really. I just try to, well, we always try to pick out the loud guys first, obviously, because they're easy picking and get them off the frequency. And then you can get down to the weaker stations that's running 500 watts or 100 watts, or in Randy's case and Tom's, 5 watts. But it's a challenge when you're out on these D expeditions. It is just mind-boggling, the QRM. I'm sorry, not the QRM, but the pile up in general. And it seems like there are literally thousands of people calling, and then all of a sudden you pick out 8Z, and that's the guy you go back to. And in most cases, everybody will shut up, and you can work that 8Z station. I got a question for Tom. Tom, I think you said early on in your introduction that you had Yaesu equipment. So do you find any particular radio is better for QRZ, or they all about the same?
Yeah, so I haven't used this year. I had the FT101. That's my first Yaesu HF rig. It actually only goes down to 5 watts, so it's not. I mean, it's a QRP rig, but you can't go any lower than that. What really opened my eyes there was the ability to have a second receiver, and a band scope, and to actually watch and listen to the pileup live is really fascinating. And of course, I only have the propagation on my end, but there are gaps in that pileup. There are people just calling and calling and calling without ever listening, and I just have no idea how they work the DX station. Along the way, for the rig I have right now for QRP, I mostly use portable, is the KX3. I think it's a great receiver. I know the 705, people love the 705 as well. Same reason, great receiver, works really well. My first QRP rig I mentioned was a 30 meter. It was out of the pages of QST by Doug DeMall, but it was a super het receiver. And at the time I was poor, but had a lot of time on my hands. So I actually etched the circuit boards and drilled them and did everything from scratch. So it was kind of fun when that thing came alive. But yeah, I've not messed around with, the old HW8s with the regenerative receivers and all. I've always had a pretty good receiver there. So I think they all work. I just think the better receiver that you can get at your disposal, the better off you'll be. And 5 watts of CW is 5 watts of CW, right? It's not hard to turn on and off a sine wave.
Yeah.
And I think to your question about, listening, Bill, and how you handle the unruly pileups and the guys that are calling on the same frequency as the DX, it's a frustration for all of us. But I think sometimes listening is a lost skill. How people cannot understand UP and CW is beyond me. It's just mind-boggling. But I guess we just try to listen through it so we can actually hear the DX station and then call where he or she is listening.
Yeah, sometimes it's funny, and I don't want this to sound like a snobbish conversation or comment, but I kind of love when the guy comes back and says, "You're 20 over 9 here in Sheboygan, but I need to confirm your call."
Yeah.
Right. So
there's so many maddening things that we've all heard on there. And speaking of people calling on the simplex on the same frequency as the DX, I think we've all heard stations that quote work the DX station, think they have come back to them, so they're going to log that contact, and they weren't even listening. And anyway, it's maddening.
The other one that drives me crazy is the especially on CW, the people that tune up on the DX frequency when they're running split. I mean, why do you push the split button after tuning up instead of putting it before? I don't understand that.
Yeah.
One thing I've done a couple times is if I hear them come back and say the Bravo station, I will jump in.
Yeah.
I'll say, "Hey, JP," whether I was calling or not, I'll hear him say Bravo. So I think
It's fair game.
Yeah, and in theory,
Okay.
he produced the pileup 126th, right? So
For sure. We all need that edge, whether
Yeah.
we QRP or not.
but I really do think it comes down to listening. And so in our club newsletter, we've interviewed, I think, over 70 different DX hams now from all different countries all over the world. And my last count was 53 of them. And I always ask him, what's the best way to QSL and those kinds of things. But What advice do you have to those of us trying to break your pileup? 53 of them have said you have to listen. You have to listen. So it's a universal problem. Joe?
Let me tell the little story. I was trying to work Scarborough Reef. And like everybody, I'm just calling my brains out and not doing any good. And this was back to the issue that we're talking about, listening. And the operator was James Brooks, who I was on a trip with later. But anyway, the operator said 257, we're on 20 meters. And he's down at 14,200 or 195, whenever. And he says 257. And I thought, man, why did that guy say that? So I quickly went up to 257 and I nailed him with one call. And that was the only contact I have ever made. I've got them all, but that's one of the few that only had one contact with a country. But back to the thing, if you don't listen, you're really, really missing out. We all want to work them, and we all want to work them right now. That's just the way I guess we all think today. But listen, listen, listen.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And to your point, Joe and Bill, you know, what amazes me is that in a pileup, people not coming back to a partial call. That's them. For example, somebody, the Alpha Juliet station come back and there's silence.
Yeah.
And then depending on how patient the DX station is, and Joe, you can relate to this, they may try them one or more times, and then finally, oh yeah, and then they come back to them. But it's like, how did you not hear your partial call sign? But
yes.
Anyway.
Because the DX station, and I've been on that end many times, that if we say Alpha Japan, we heard that Alpha Japan. We didn't come up with that just out of the blue. And yes, that's happened many times, and you wonder, well, where did the guy go? Did his radio quit? Did the power supply fail? But I definitely heard that Alpha Japan. Yes.
You know, I can't think of his call. Was Wayne McKenzie? Was he K8LEE?
LEE, yeah.
Yes.
So Wayne was an avid DXer. I think he went with you to Montenegro, Joe, is the first expedition.
Yes.
And he used to tell a great story about, he would tell him full calls only, full calls only. And this guy kept yelling, "Hey, Charlie, hey, Charlie, hey, Charlie." So finally Wayne said, "Hey, Charlie, you're in the log now, QSY." You know, that's not good when you're on that end of it. So I like to think things have improved though, right? We don't need insurance contacts anymore. And if I were a QRP station, I would feel like I'd have to get insurance contacts if I could.
Yeah.
So I think that's better. The ability to go out in some cases in real time and determine that, yeah, I really am in the log. I think that helps. But do you guys feel like, and maybe Joe, for you, it would be when you're on the other end, but do you feel like operating QRP has made you a better operator, Tom?
I definitely think so. You have to listen. You have to be on your game, right? You have to be ready. Most of my operating QRP is CW. I'm not brave enough, Randy, to try sideband. But I just think that's done a lot for my general CW operating, right? I'm listening to the pile up, trying to figure out where it's going, and I'm ready to stick my call in at any time. And as you said, sometimes somebody's covering the DX station where they're tuning up or they're calling, and you know you're listening well enough to hear the piece of your call, and you get back in there and you can get it completed even through the QRM. So I think it has done a lot. It's just it's sometimes QRO, you know, you make a few calls and you break through and okay, I'm done. You don't have to work at it as much.
Randy, what do you think?
No, I agree 100% with Tom. I think you do have to use certain little techniques and the timing we've talked about, but in really listening very well. You know, I don't want to miss that one opportunity I have. If he gives me a partial, I've got to be on it, and using on sideband, using good phonetics. And on CW, if they're running simplex, still just slightly off frequency. Again, to get, and I know Tom knows this very well, and Joe would from the other end, just to help distinguish yourself a little bit from that mass So I think I've had to learn to be a better operator to be effective with QRP.
Joe, what did you learn from being on the other end, you think?
It's crazy. Well, I guess that's a good question because we're in both two different positions. You guys transmitting and us on DXpeditions, receiving. But it is very, very stressful. And Tom's been, I know for sure, in St. Lucia. But you got the headset on. There's three of us on a 6 foot, 8 foot table, and it's just really mind-boggling. But it's back to the same thing for the DX operator. He or she also has to listen because there's all these people calling, and who's the D0, because we don't get all that call. Matter of fact, you're lucky if you do get the whole call. So you're always dealing with bits and pieces that you're trying to put together, and hopefully the other stations will be quiet, stand by while you make that one QSO. And as far as the weak stations, the QRP stations, I don't know so much that they've ever identified themselves. I agree with Randy. They're just in the pile up, and he or she will work as QRP and the way they go. So I'm not so sure that that's a big thing on the DX end that you announce your QRP. I think Randy's got it down pat. Randy, a question that I have early on, you said you work CW sideband mainly, and Tom's the same way. What about FTA? Is that not a good mode for you?
I think it probably is a good mode for low power QRP. I just haven't gone that direction, Joe. It's just not my cup of tea. And, I've been doing the sideband CW thing for 40, 50 years. And I guess I'm staying that way so what I've got on the wall is those two modes. And again, it's just a philosophical thing, a personal choice. So fair question, Joe, but yeah, that's just been my decision.
Yes, sure. Thank you.
One thing I wanted to mention, Joe, you mentioned headphones. I know earlier Bill had asked about headphones versus speakers. I always tell my daughter, who she got her license 4 years ago, she's now 16, KE0WPA. I tell, and Kylie is firmly committed to QRP too, so I guess she's totally brainwashed. But I always tell her, listen hard. And to that point, I use headphones 99.9% of the time. And part of the, certainly on sideband, I've got a Heil headset with a mic, but even for CW, I hear better. And certainly as my age advances a little bit, I think that's that much more important. And about the only time I'll throw a speaker on is if there's somebody else in the room, I want them to hear what I'm hearing. But I don't want to overplay that. But to me, that's part of the whole listening hard thing.
Sure.
Sounds
Randy,
like we should have invited your daughter as well.
Randy,
He tried to steal the show.
Yeah.
Randy, do you have beverage antennas at home?
No, sir, I do not. But that's a good question, Joe. First of all, I don't have the room for it. I'm on a residential lot, and my antennas for 160 and 80 for transmit wouldn't justify having a beverage. 160 is a struggle for me because I'm trying to tune an 80 meter dipole, so I just do that for mults. But
You need the K6MM helically wound vertical for 160, and I can tell you all about that someday.
I need the radial space though too.
So one of the other techniques that I've heard guys use, and it's been used on me a couple times in the WPX competition, is you're listening to a pileup, right? So you're listening to TZ4, and you can hear NR8Z off to the side also calling. So NR8Z works him, and now you can jump over and say NR8Z up 10. Have you ever used something like that to draw somebody away so you could work them? Yeah, anybody?
I have on occasion, yeah. Or if especially in a domestic contest, if I hear a molt that I need calling another station. So the molt doesn't have the frequency, he's not running, but that potential molt calls him. And I'm thinking, oh man, I haven't heard in Idaho, I need Idaho. And I know, so I figure I got a 50-50 chance. Is he going up or down the band? So if I can find a clear spot 3 kcs away, I may drop in a CQ, and surprisingly it works sometimes.
Yes, I've done that myself, yes.
Oh, I have not tried that. I have tried to pull someone out of a pileup just real quick. I haven't been that successful at it, but maybe they just didn't hear me.
So I know that there is a large QRP function at Hamvention, right? And it's coming up in a few weeks. Anybody been to that and would want to supply a plug for those guys?
No.
Tom, is that the 5 days in May?
4 days in May. Yeah, I've been to 4 days in May, FDIM. It's really a lot of fun. Of course, I can only do part of it since my heart is really with Southwest Ohio DX Association
Well,
dinner and the DX Forum. So, but I have on Thursday, they'll have a day of forums on speakers. A lot of that is on construction. And you can go to the QRP ARCI site, and the speakers are there and all the information's there about it. It's a lot of fun. It's I would guess they get 150-ish people, something like that. It's a smaller group, so it's easy to talk to folks. It's easy to talk to the speakers. They have a show and tell night, which is some people who are selling equipment are there. There's been lately a lot of magnetic loops and different kinds of portable antennas there. There are folks just showing off their latest project. Locally we have Jack Gaspar, WATEE, and Al, I can't remember his call sign. They do a lot of neat projects and they'll be there showing stuff off. They have a banquet, and they also have a club night. So there's a lot of good QRP activity, and it's separate. It's over at the Holiday Inn in Fairborn. So it's a little bit separate from everything. But yeah, if you're a QRPer and you don't know about that, I definitely would check it out.
so this may seem like a silly question, but if I wanted to get started in QRP, what advice or what approach? Do I literally just turn the power down to 5 watts and off we go? Randy?
Yeah. Turn the knob down. Yep. That's what I would do. And, in fact, we talk about that a little bit. I think maybe it's in the second column that I'm putting together, Bill, but yeah, that's, most rigs can go down to 5 watts. So crank it down and give it a try, and they will, you'll surprise yourself. And, I think, Tom and I probably have had the experience of working another station in a casual setting, not in a contest, but then mention that, great to hear you. I'm running good propagation. Glad of that, since I'm QRP with 5 watts. Oh, well, let me crank it down. And so the guy on the other end will crank it down, and DX stations will do this, and it's just a hoot, and they will surprise themselves.
Wow.
And
So
the big benefit of doing that, you're familiar with the radio. There's nothing else to learn. You already know what all the knobs do and how to work it. So really the only change you want to make is have that transmit power at 5 watts.
Joe, can you imagine how cold your shack would be if you turned off your amplifiers?
I'm gonna have to read the manual, see how to turn it down.
So Randy, Joe will historically just lay Pop-Tarts on top of his amplifier if he's going to be in a long contest, just to
Of course,
keep him warm.
it's the old story that I've heard so many times from old operators, that if everybody would shut up, you could work around the world on 5 watts. And after listening to you guys, I guess that is really so true.
I think that's a very good point, Joe. And I do think it is true, with the exception of when conditions are really marginal. Obviously, a kilowatt and a half is going to get through, and they're not going to even know I'm there. And I've been CQ'd in my face. I imagine Tom has too. Whether it's a contest or whatever, you're calling this DX station, and they're calling CQ right back at you. So it ain't happening.
Yeah,
Wow.
sure.
And I-
Frustrating.
So you have to resist the reach to the knob, right? That's first thing. You got to be willing to move off and listen.
Yeah,
I think-
but that's a good point, Bill. Personally, I have never, somebody asked me that here many years ago. Well, have you ever, increased the power to get somebody you couldn't get? And I mean, maybe I'm not too bright, but it frankly just never occurred to me because that's not my mindset. I've just taken the philosophy, being the masochist that I apparently am, that if I can't get them with 5 watts, I'm not going to get them. Not today. But this knob just sits here at 5 watts. So,
you brought up a good point a little bit ago about listening hard, because I think we can all relate to when you, independent of QRP, right? You're trying to work somebody, especially maybe on CW, and after an hour, maybe you get them, maybe you don't, but propagation fades and you're done. You take the head, all of a sudden you realize, dang, I'm tired. I got a stress headache, or I've got, because you are locked in for a good solid, and it's not easy. It's not easy to go that long and stay focused. So you got to practice. I think you got to have yourself in the chair, right? And you got to practice, and you got to be consistent. So I've already determined. I think Wednesday night is the next CW Ops has their weekly. So I think I'm going to run that with 5 watts. I know what my normal count is, my normal rate. So I'll be curious to see with my vertical what I can do and where I can go, et cetera. So I'll report back later. But that's my challenge for the week, is to try that Wednesday night. So we'll see.
well, you'll have fun with it. And, this NA single sideband sprint was over the weekend, and I like that contest as well as the NA QSO parties. But I got 150 Qs in 3.5 hours on sideband in that thing. And it's just, things went well. Conditions were good, but it will surprise you.
Wow.
That brings me back to a point Randy made, and I know I've got a lot to learn here, is when is the effort futile? You mentioned search and pounce. If you're hitting a station once a minute, that's pretty good. I know I have a hard time figuring out where that line is. So maybe, Randy, you have some perspective, whether it's, casual operating, de-expedition, or contesting. When do you just say, I got to move on?
I wish I was smart enough to know the answer to that, Tom. Whether it's a contest, you're chasing that rare molt, or whether it's a DX station, and there's a good sized pileup on them. One of the secrets, I think, QRP is being patient and being persistent. However, at some point, it borders on, stupidity to keep calling into the ether, and you don't have a chance. I have to guard against my competitiveness to keep doing it versus just tuning away. Now, but one of the interesting things, and this happened here a month or two ago, I was calling one of the FR8s that was on, or FR5, I can't remember, but one of Rodriguez Island stations or Fox Radio, and big pile up on him. I couldn't get through. So I tuned away, and about 5 kcs away, not an exaggeration, there was another FR. I got him on the first call. And I can remember reading, there's no new ideas, right? There's no original ideas. It's all regurgitated. And I can remember reading years ago somebody saying something along those same lines, regardless of QRP or not. If you're calling this, this station, and everybody wants, there's a big pileup and probably been spotted, so just tune away, because the propagation's good to that area, and you might find the same darn country. So,
Wow.
So what happens to me, Tom? I get frustrated, and I've called for an hour, and I'm nowhere near working this guy, and I'm just frustrated because I'm high strung to begin with. So then I got to go get a cup of coffee, or more than likely a Miller Lite, and come back in and start all over.
One of the things I've found is, now, if it's a de-expedition, you typically have a pretty good idea how long they're going to be there. And usually I don't even fool with them in the first couple of days. I'm just trying to have a little bit of common sense. And so I can figure out there'll be easier pickings, or maybe not as difficult the last few days. But again, we don't know what's going to happen to propagation. If it's like it was yesterday, it's going to be,
Oh, gee.
worthless. But so stepping back, and one of the crazy things, Joe, is sometimes I'll step back, and I don't have the patience to go an hour. Half an hour is a long time, and I may come back to them later, and son of a gun, an hour later or 2 hours later, I punch through because the propagation's changed that much, or maybe they're gone.
Yes.
So,
Wow.
Yeah, I rarely get into a contest in the first 6 hours. It'll be Friday evening and my wife will say, "Didn't you tell me there was a contest on this weekend?" I say, "Yeah, but I'm not going to start for a few hours. It's just not worth it."
See, and I always tell Karen, yeah, I got to get in because Tom's not starting until tomorrow morning and I got to get a head start. Yeah, yesterday was a real step back to about 5 years, I think, because there was nothing anywhere. So anyway,
It was bad.
anything I left out, Randy?
Gosh, I don't think so. I think we've done a good job of covering it, Bill. I appreciate that. And, but I think just give it a try.
Tom?
No, I think you're right. Give it a try. It's easy enough to turn the knob down and leave everything else the same, and you'll have some fun.
Joe?
Well, I'm going to take you guys' advice. I'm going to read the manual, and I'm going to figure out this my drive button, and I'm going to turn that baby down to 0, 5 watts.
You're going to turn the amplifier off, though, right? That's the other part.
I can't believe I said that, but we'll see.
Well, I think that's great, right? Because we all want to try something new. I never even thought about turning the power down for the CW ops, and that's nice because that's kind of a target-rich environment. So I'm not going to sit there for a half hour, but who knows? And then I'll get mad because if I end up getting the same rate I usually get. Oh my, I should have been doing this. So
well, this has been very informative for me, Tom and Randy and Bill, because not being a QRP operator, you guys have brought a lot to mind here. So I certainly appreciate you guys coming on and me being involved.
and of course Tom is an accomplished operator, and always great to get his input. And Randy's in that upper echelon of 300 plus on sideband QRP, which just obviously I have no idea what I'm talking about, because if somebody would ask me if that was possible, I said, boy, I don't know. So you've opened my eyes up to challenge me and give me some new things to work on. And again, I can't tell you how appreciative I am that you're willing to be our QRP columnist in the Southwest Ohio DX newsletter. I'm excited about that, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Randy.
Well, you guys have a good week, and again, thanks for your time. And I'll see you on the bands. It may be up 12 instead of up 10, but I'll see you there. So thanks a lot.
Take care.
See you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Did you learn something new? I certainly did. That was outstanding. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the DX Mentor. I'd also like to thank our gurus on this episode, Joe, WAGEX, Tom, NR8Z, and Randy, ND0C. I'd love to have your feedback, answer your questions, and provide help with any DX or amateur radio issues that you may be having. If you need clarification on something or you just have a question, contact me at thedxmentor@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter using the handle TheDXMentor. An episode schedule and more information can be found at ajb.com/the-dx-mentor-podcast. Please drop me a line if you've achieved an all-time new one, received recognition, or have a DX event that you would like us to mention. We would be happy to do that. 7-3 for this episode, and as always, thanks to my XYL Karen for her love and support.